Words and worldview. When I began my study and reflection on the meaning of the word heaven and others related to it, such as eternity and perfection, in various historical Western worldviews, I had the opportunity to find precious sources of information that made my task easier. Among them are books such as The Discarded Image, by C.S. Lewis, novelist and professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at the University of Oxford, and conferences such as the one entitled Cosmology, Making Sense of the Universe, given by the planetary sciences doctor and Jesuit brother, Guy Consolmagno, at the University of Arizona College of Science in 2011. Due to the presence and influence of sources of information such as those mentioned, I clarify that with this book, I do not intend to develop innovative ideas, nor do I aspire to reinvent the wheel. Whoever wants formal and advanced technical or academic knowledge on these subjects can go directly to these sources and other similar ones. Instead, as an enthusiast of linguistics, history, worldviews, and theology, but above all as a father who wants to guide his children as best he can in these matters that concern anyone, my purposes in this book are: 1. Knowing or reviewing and then deepening and reflecting on the meaning of certain concepts over time and through some worldviews. 2. Sharing my reflections and reasoning about it. 3. Arguing and supporting my opinion that these concepts are still helpful, valuable, and worth keeping in use and further developing their scope. Although it is easy to find definitions and explanations of these words, their meaning is not evident to many of us today. Thus, I begin by recognizing that words are linguistic units, signs of expression, and communication whose meaning is determined or significantly enriched by the cultural context and the worldview of the society which formulates them. And in many cases, they serve not only to represent something but to help us take a position or guide us concerning what they refer to. Therefore, when a society's worldview changes, the original meaning of certain words can be blurred, masked, hidden, changed, or lost. Curiously, some words resist these changes and can still be used in the new worldview, but in such a way that people no longer see other meanings outside themselves. The signifier gradually becomes the signified but with a meaning difficult to define because of its disconnection from the original. It is no longer so easy for us to make sense of the meaning of certain words and orient ourselves or take a position for them and what they refer to. They end up being defined only with putative synonyms and then given the meanings of those putative synonyms. This can create confusion, difficulty finding them useful, or even the desire to abandon using those words, even within the context or scope in which they arose. Instead of the language and vocabulary growing, we tend, at best, to settle for changing an old word for a new one or, at worst, to reduce that vocabulary and give up even trying to change it. Some of this can happen with words such as heaven, eternity, and perfection. For example, what does heaven mean to believers today? Is it the same as the heaven where the sun, the other stars, the moon, and the planets are? And if we distinguish one heaven from the other today, was it ever considered the same? And what about the writings that speak of the heavens, in the plural? What are these heavens, or heavenly places, and where are they? What relationship does the heavenly have with the eternal and with the perfect? Is perfect merely the absence of errors? What do we understand by eternal? Is eternal life the same as living forever or for all the years the universe has ahead of it? Was paradise always considered a heaven with clouds and winged beings, or have there been other ways of thinking about it? Some of these questions may come not just from skeptics or adult people intent on ridiculing the religious beliefs of others but from genuinely interested people, including our children. Thus, as in the example I mentioned in the previous section, if a father buys a telescope to watch heaven, and it happens that the grandmother has just passed away and, by shared faith, the family hopes that she has gone to heaven, could you use the telescope to watch her? The quick and easy answer is no, because we are not referring to the same heaven, but then, once again, why do we call both heavens? This circumstance comes from the difference between the cosmological vision of the culture, which developed the concept and wrote specific texts, and the worldview of our current society. Let us briefly see what we understand by cosmology and worldview. Etymologically, cosmology means words about the universe or the reason we can find in it, the logic of the cosmos. It is a term that the German philosopher Christian Wolff developed in the 17th century to describe the type of metaphysics that dealt with the totality of what exists, the philosophical knowledge of the general laws that govern the universe. Even in his original concept, Wolff intended that his cosmology study the nature and being of the universe, not just the way its pieces worked and were related. However, the term cosmology has changed, has become narrower or more specific, and is used today mainly to describe that part of astronomy that deals with the general laws of the origin and evolution of the universe. We thus observe that the word changed from a philosophical term to a scientific one. On the other hand, we currently use the term worldview more to refer to the broader aspect, vision, image, or global conception of the universe that a particular society, culture, or school of thought has. This global image or conception of the universe is usually the result of the sum of specific perceptions, conceptualizations, assessments, and assumptions about the environment and how the universe works. In turn, these assumptions can be conscious or unconscious because they link closely to culture, influencing not only the answers to some questions about reality but even the questions we formulate. There are, in fact, some assumptions in modern science that we sometimes ignore. For example, Guy Consolmagno mentions 3 assumptions of current science that come from or have significant influence from the Greek and Christian civilizations. The first assumption is that the world is real, that it is not a dream or a virtual simulation, as conceived by some other religions or some modern spiritual beliefs, which propose that each one of us builds a world for himself in mind. For these beliefs, it's all in the mind, not so much in a shared reality. Or, they argue that we live in a digital or virtual simulation created by a supercomputer in the style of the Matrix movie. However, without the assumption of a real and common world, there would be no point in studying any aspect of what we consider to be a reality since we would never reach agreements, since each person would have a different reality in their mind, or we would be deceiving ourselves in a world virtual. For this reason, current science and Christianity continue to consider that the world is real. The second assumption is that the world is intelligible and works in an orderly manner, that human beings can understand it, so it is not chaotic or unpredictable, and that it was not born due to an oversight, a whim, or a war, as mentioned by some other ancient religions and myths. The intelligibility discovered in the natural world generally began with an animated image, as when we try to understand and predict an animal's behavior. For example, we can predict our dog's behavior to a certain extent when we serve its food or when we get home, but the truth is that we are not always 100% right. In the same way, many ancient cultures began to recognize specific patterns in nature, intelligible patterns, but in the end, they were still considered capricious. After the scientific revolution and especially from the 17th century, the image of nature changed from one animalistic to a completely mechanistic one. Scientists began to see the world as a cold piece of fine clockwork and pretended to accurately and precisely predict all its movements all the time if having enough information. However, in the 20th century, they could not sustain the mechanistic image, and the vision began to change at the level of subatomic particles for scenarios that were no longer accurate and precise but rather probabilistic. Even so, the intelligibility of these scenarios continues to be assumed, as they can be studied and expressed through mathematical language. Finally, the third assumption is that wanting to know and understand the world is good. This assumption implies that both, the world and our intellect, are good because we hope to obtain something favorable by studying reality. If it were not so, studying the environment would be of little value to us and perhaps even dangerous. Again, this is an assumption that not all religions have considered being so, and even today, some groups see knowledge of nature as a threat. However, both Christianity and Greek civilization, in general, did consider the knowledge of reality as something good. And these three assumptions are just that, beliefs or a priori ideas that support science but are outside of it and cannot be scientifically proved according to this activity's current methods and criteria. In any case, these assumptions can be treated and considered more philosophically than scientifically. However, We can notice that these assumptions exist and are part of our worldview, so it is important to be aware of them. Evolution and evolution of concepts. We should also consider that concepts evolve. But how do we understand this evolution? Since Charles Darwin's book about the origin of species was published, the term evolution has often been used simplistically or incorrectly by people in areas of knowledge other than biology. This simplistic view has given rise to myths and misinterpretations. For example, some people commonly assume that evolution necessarily implies the replacement of the old by the new, that the new creature has a better chance of survival than the old, that the old one necessarily dies out, that adaptation is the same as acceptance, that the progress of the system is marked by what is newest, and that for this reason what is new is superior. All this results from misunderstanding evolution as a simple single-line growth process. However, the observation of nature tells us that evolution consists more of a branched or arborescent growth, in which the new branches can coexist with other more distant and old ones. This process creates a more complex and diverse system, which allows the coexistence of new forms with old forms, of new creatures with ancestral creatures, and of novel ideas with traditional ideas, without any of them having an assured advantage in new and unknown scenarios. Let us think, for example, of complex mammals such as human beings, which coexist with other older and simpler animals, such as reptiles, amphibians, or insects, or with plants, or even with bacteria. Without the existence of the newer and more advanced organism, complex entails the extinction of the others, nor give it more chances to survive in the face of an unexpected change in the environment. This coexistence can also happen with societies, worldviews, ideas, methods, concepts, and words. It is clear that some forms are becoming extinct, but the system generally grows in complexity, with increasingly more diverse forms coexisting together. Furthermore, adaptation to new situations sometimes results in creatures that are more complex in themselves. However, adaptation does not necessarily mean acceptance of this increased complexity either, but rather survival. This survival may sometimes include accepting the new conditions, but in other cases, it may even mean resistance to them. Therefore, it is possible to survive through a resistance strategy. Both resistance and acceptance can be ways of adjusting to a new reality. And natural selection can benefit both creatures that accept change and those that resist it, as long as both can make the necessary adjustments to survive in the new environment. Therefore, in the face of a new reality, a more evolved or more complex form or creature does not necessarily ensure its success over a less evolved one, which is also adapted or survives current situations, although in a different way. A less evolved creature might even better adapt to new conditions than a more evolved creature. For example, it is possible that a cockroach or a crocodile, species millions of years older than human beings and apparently less evolved, may have a better chance of surviving than we do in the face of specific changes in the environment. This scenario is possible because they have more experience surviving environmental changes. Once again, this can also happen with societies, worldviews, ideas, methods, concepts, and words. In this way, the progress or evolution of the system is marked not only by what is newest but also by the scenario with greater complexity of the whole, given by the coexistence of new and old forms. And this evolution indicates a kind of selection, adaptation or survival, either by acceptance or resistance, in the face of more complex and diverse conditions. Similarly, societies, worldviews, ideas, methods, concepts, and words change and evolve, but this does not necessarily imply that the older forms must become extinct, nor that the new ones have their future assured. We don't have to replace the old just because it opposes the new, nor do we have to accept everything new just because it is new. Rather, the natural evolution trend is growth through more extensive and increasing coexistence of the old with the new in an environment of greater complexity. Therefore, it is essential to know or recognize those concepts that have managed to survive over time and from different cultures and worldviews. Among these concepts are heaven, eternity, and perfection. They have survived so many environmental changes, probably because they are still valuable and will continue to be so for our descendants.